So welcome, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us here right on the cusp of the holiday season, and excited for you all to learn a bit about 5G. So this is Gregg Rowe talking. I'm the Chief Channel Officer with Globalgig. I also have Roger Billings on, who is Chief Architect with Cradlepoint. And today's webinar is going to be all about 5G. What is it? Why does it matter? Where is it in terms of its availability? And probably even with all of that, most importantly, what can you be doing now with your customers and in your business to prepare your customers and be ready as 5G starts to become available? So that's the gist of the webinar. This is all being recorded, so it'll also be available via recording. If you have questions, you can do that right on the GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar field and put your questions in there. I've already loaded the handout or the deck that we'll be going through, so you will have that as well that you can download. So with that, let's take the next step. So just high level, so you know who Globalgig is, and then I'm going to hand this over to Roger Billings to let you know who Cradlepoint is, and then really fill you in on 5G as Roger is immersed into all that is going on with 5G. So Globalgig is a global MVNO, which means we're a wireless service provider. We utilize the incumbent mobile networks across 200 plus countries, and we service use cases from Internet of Things to failover and business continuity to primary connectivity. We also couple in with that a full array of other connectivity solutions. So we will aggregate connectivity for customers as well and overlay that all with managed services. And we are a very significant partner with Cradlepoint, who is a leader in the wireless networking and SD-WAN field, and especially as 5G comes in the 5G space. So that's who Globalgig is, and I'm going to turn this over to Roger so that he can give you a high level on Cradlepoint and talk to you about 5G.
Thanks, Greg. And I'll just see if I can, are you going to pass the presenter? Okay, perfect, controlled by me. So Cradlepoint has been around for a little over 10 years and has actually been considered the worldwide leader in LTE routing. And I would say that the easiest tagline is that we are a cloud-managed LTE routing company that sells software. We just happen to sell hardware along with that to be able to get connectivity into the LTE networks. We've had some extremely large success in the worldwide retailers. Obviously, as we started our business with the failover market and then have expanded that out into being the primary market as well as the mobility space and dealing with failover as well as parallel networking. All right. There we go. So a lot of things that we look about is there's a lot of dislocation opportunity in the market, especially with where we saw LTE come out and where we saw the 5G coming. Some things have changed. So the world's largest movie house is, Netflix. 1/3 of all the internet traffic goes over Netflix. The largest hotel chain is now Airbnb. And as we look at every day, our smartphones are the actual encyclopedias that we used to have to go to the library to look at. And over the last 11 years, Amazon Web Services has become the world's largest data center. And of course, Spotify has the largest music provider and no longer a record store or things like that. And as we look at where 5G can come, we can look in the rearview mirror and talk about what do we do when we want to call a cab nowadays. In most cases, people use the verb, to get an Uber, or I'm going to Uber somewhere. Uber didn't exist before LTE. And the reason for that was that they didn't have the networking capability to be able to do the Google Maps and have the integration. So as we think about where 5G is going and how it can be very transformative, look in the rearview mirror and see that what's changed in terms of how we actually commute on a day-to-day basis, and all these other things such as Spotify and Airbnb and Netflix, and how we're using our mobile phones to be able to handle all that. So one of the reasons why 5G matters is there's 4 different various use cases. First being sort of a remote subject matter experts or a virtual workforce. And then we take that one step further and start talking about low latency applications and how those could become more practical. Add in increased upload bandwidth for video surveillance with AR, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and augmented reality. And it really goes pretty well. But when we look at, again, in the rearview mirror and seeing where are the most beneficial use cases, wireless is becoming the sole WAN source. We think that wireless has definitely won the day. When you go into the office, usually you don't plug in anymore, you use the Wi-Fi. When you have a mouse and a keyboard, you don't plug that anymore, it's all wireless. And then when you connect to your handset, you're basically using probably a Bluetooth earpiece for that. So we're thinking wireless has definitely won the day, and because it's become much more commercially available and much more stable, that LTE and the Gigabit LTE, as we go on the pathway to 5G, will definitely start winning people over. Now, this only happens to occur and works really well as soon as we start changing our rate plans and going to new things such as, a fixed rate wireless service. So where are we on the pathway? So obviously 2G networks in the US at least have closed down in 2017. Both Verizon and Sprint have said they're shutting down their alternative 3G networks, which were in this case for CDMA. But 4G is actually going to be with us until the late 2030s because it's actually the way that 5G setup is made. So 4G Gigabit LTE is part of the 5G standard, and it leads us into the 5G fixed wireless and the 5G full-featured mobility side of things. So let's look and see where that actually looks like, what components there are. So we have a fixed component, which is a very high bandwidth piece, and then we have the mobile usage, which is targeted at those users that may want to move around like we had in the LTE, but still get that high bandwidth. It's going to be failing back and forth to the Gigabit LTE because that is the go-to failback component. And of course, as we go out into the country and we go outside of the major cities or metropolitan areas, foundationally, we're going to fall back to the typical 4G LTE that we know and love today. But when we look at it on a technical aspect, how are the operators achieving Gigabit LTE? Well, the first thing is a technology standard called 256 QAM. What that means is it allows you to have 256 pieces of information per waveform, so it gives them much better density. We layer on top of that something called MIMO, or multiple input, multiple output, which allows us to have more than one conversation occurring at the same time. Now, the operators on themselves are actually putting in what they call massive MIMO, which is more than 4 layers, which allows them to actually have multiple conversations and actually make their network more efficient. Now, to add the speed on top of that, we actually add more carriers or bandwidth carriers, not as in AT&T and Verizon and something else, but basically adding more bands and more pieces of carrier wave RF to add the other both licensed and possibly unlicensed spectrum into a wider channel to give you that Gigabit LTE type scenario. This all falls through in the same type of scenario when we talk about 5G as well. But for 5G, the promises that we're getting, obviously with this, we're getting better connection density, so more efficient signaling and better network efficiency and traffic capacity. So when you're in the football stadium with 50,000 of your closest friends, you'll actually have a good signal and you'll actually be able to use it. And they're able to do that by having much better spectrum efficiency, which at the end of the day is really allows us as the network users to have decreased in latency and increased throughput. For the operators, it gives them a more consistent user experience and better economics to be able to offer different rate plans to be able to service higher numbers of users at higher amounts of bandwidth. So obviously flat rate pricing is going to be something that the operators are looking at and considering as we go forward into the 5G realm. So let's talk a little bit about the spectrum and where that's going. So there's lots of talk about millimeter wave, and there's also talk about using the 600 megahertz stuff that's down in the very bottom. Now there's trade-offs between one and the other. With millimeter wave, it goes very fast, but it doesn't travel very far. So we're limited in less than 500 meters or 1,500 feet type of thing, with an average about 500 to 700 feet between small cells. But then on the other side, with the 600 megahertz, that can propagate up to 60 kilometers. And the major holder of that space is currently T-Mobile at the 600 megahertz. They have around an average about 35 megahertz of bandwidth in that space. They think they can actually do fairly good speeds when they start using that for 5G. Now, the system's actually bifurcated into what we call two different distinct zones. One is what we call millimeter wave, which is above 6 gigahertz, and then what we call the below 6 gigahertz spectrum, which is typically where the cellular has played before. 600 to 2300 megahertz is the typical spectrum range. Obviously, Sprint in the Clearwire acquisition a while back acquired 100 megahertz of 2.5 gigahertz bandwidth. And of course, in the US, they have something called CBRS, which is in the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, and is actively being used as a lightly licensed technology. On top of that, there's also the ability to use Wi-Fi for multi-fire for private LTE, or LAA, or what's called license-assisted access. Now, where Cradlepoint, let me go back into that one, sorry. Where Cradlepoint really comes in is the whole interference avoidance and antenna design, and how to do radio remoting. We have learned a lot in terms of over the last 10 years of having the ability to take a 2.5 gigahertz signal and actually rebroadcast that out at 2.4 gigahertz. Took a little work from a physics perspective, but we learned a lot and have put those practices into how we design our products going forward. And of course, antenna design, being able to have the support from the 600 to 6 gigahertz range in a single antenna, so you don't have specific antennas for specific operators, makes it really easy. Especially when you're dealing with an MVNO, it has multiple operators across the globe. You don't know what frequencies you're actually going to be on, so having an antenna that actually supports that from a mobility perspective is very critical. And of course, on top of that, to make Cradlepoint a little bit easier to use and all of our services easier to use, we have what's called zero-touch configuration. So our cloud management software allows you to pre-configure every device in the network and make changes very quickly and easily, from that being the software upgrades to modem upgrades to actual configuration changes on a per-group basis. One of our customers has about 40,000 devices out there, and it's managed by one individual, because it just makes it really that easy with the cloud management to get things working. So where are the U.S. carriers in their 5G rollout plans? Well, Verizon has typically announced already on October 1st. They had their ultra-wideband broadband services, and that's at the 28 gigahertz spectrum. But on the flip side of that, is that they have a Gigabit LTE in about 1,100 markets. And so that allows them to have high speed where they are, but for 5G, but being able to fall back to a Gigabit LTE. Now, the performance on both Verizon and AT&T's fixed wireless offering has been what they call Gigabit symmetrical. So on average, you're going to see between 400 and 800 megs up and down, as opposed to what we've seen in the past on our LTE carriers, where we have high download speeds, but still limited in the upload side of things. Sprint and T-Mobile are in the process of trying to finalize a merger, but if that doesn't happen, Sprint has, as I said before, that 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, of which they're looking about getting about a 500 megabits per second estimated type bandwidth, as they've stated publicly. They'll be launching their 5G information in the first half of 2019, and from the Gigabit LTE side of things, it's about 2/3 of the network. T-Mobile, on the other hand, has a whole bunch of 600 megahertz spectrum, and they'll be announcing that as part of their 5G rollout. They're thinking about 450 megs is what they estimate the bandwidth is going to be, and they're pretty much covering the whole country, 992 markets as of August 18, and they're looking at launching a 5G here in 2019 that'll be showing the map as a pure magenta map, I believe, is probably what they're going to go out with, being they own a whole bunch of 600, and it goes a very long way. So before we start there, let's go into a little bit of some of the use cases of where things are going from both from both Gigabit LTE as well as 5G. So today we currently have operators using LTE for failure for high availability, and they prioritize the critical traffic. So the LTE signals today can't handle all the traffic they might want to put on it, so they have to remove some of it. Let's say some of the videos or something along those lines. As we go forward with tomorrow with Gigabit LTE, we'll be able to handle all traffic in failover mode. And the data plan changes may offer the ability to have an active load balancing with the LTE link. So you can augment your bandwidth with LTE bandwidth from the Gigabit LTE perspective. And we've seen this in terms of our pathway. As we look here at the bottom of the screen, day one connectivity allows you to be able to get the LTE immediately into your network and then use it as a failover or as a sidebar of doing parallel networking. Pandora is a prime example of this on our website, where they have day one internet, where they bring up a store, and then as that store becomes profitable, or they believe that store location is going to be profitable, then they order in the secondary link, which is going to be a DSL or cable modem or something like that. And then that becomes a failover link at the end of the day. So Pandora is already on the way to the pathway to 5G, and as we get to Gigabit LTE, they'll even have higher speeds for failover and or primary when they first bring the network up. The second side is sort of the fixed sites cutting the wires. We have a lot of retail stores and offices are looking at saving money. They've gone to SD-WAN type technologies with both DSL and or cable, but they're still having to deal with between 60 and 100 different providers across the U.S. providing that service. It's much easier, like what you have for Globalgig, is be able to have a single provider to provide everything that you want. But then how do you do that from a wired perspective? So some of the retail operators are going to an MVNO for one connection and maybe something else for another connection, or using AT&T for one side and let's say Verizon. Now, as we go with a 5G, that's a viable replacement for fiber. And especially when we start talking about all you can eat or fixed costs as opposed to paying per bit. We're seeing some providers or some retail environments replace the single Cisco router with 2 Cradlepoint routers for less than the price of the replacement Cisco box, and then being able to use that with different carriers and have much better service and much faster returns on things, and add 5G where it's necessary to add more bandwidth or lower latency depending on the application. Again, Carlos Bakery is one of the first ones that have done that, and United Oil is another one that's already on that pathway that's actually doing permanently fixed sites with no wires coming in at all. But we look at other sides of things, other sides of the coin. Remote SMEs, or subject matter experts, are really driving an idea of being able to have much smarter connectivity. We've taken the human out of the retail store by creating a kiosk. Now we're adding the human back in so that they can have better availability, better service, better quality of care, especially when we start talking about it from a healthcare perspective. So the idea here is, let's say today we have a customer that actually uses a fixed DSL connection, and that provides them the ability for a doctor to have an office location, or a clinic can be in a pharmacy, of which they don't have any trained professionals there, but they Uberize the doctors. And so the doctors will do their normal shift and then sign on and be able to take remote consultation with patients. This is typically used by the millennial generation who doesn't tend to want to make an appointment at the doctor's office. They just want to go into a location, put their credit card in, and get something done from a self-service perspective. And now that can be enabled with both LTE, but as we go with 5G, we can actually have newer types of technologies, such as the ability to understand with a patient donning a glove that lets the doctor feel exactly what the patient feels remotely. So very interesting type of technology. And we talk about other sides of the coin, things like MRIs, where we don't really necessarily need low latency, or we need much greater bandwidth, because now you can actually have remote consulting with the doctor and the MRI technician at the same time, as opposed to having to wait for the DVD to come out and then you take the DVD to the doctor. So you have a much better quality of care and much faster term to resolution. A third area that we really consider is sort of that video surveillance and augmented reality. We're seeing a lot of video surveillance going up around the world, and but the problem is capabilities are limited. Right now it's a store and forward type scenario, where, for instance, when we look at the Boston bombing, it took us about 3 days to figure out who the guy was in the red hat and where they went and so forth. Being able to do real-time high-def monitoring would definitely save time and get better resolution, especially for our first responders. Allows them to go much quicker. Now, being able to take that one step further and actually add augmented reality into that, we have a partnership with a company called Stitch AI that can actually use machine learning and augmented reality to be able to determine what is happening in an environment. For instance, we as humans can look at a video screen and see somebody coming into a ski mask in the middle of summer into a mall. We can think something's going on, but being able to train the computers to do the same thing is what this company does. They're also going to be able to target the active shooter and figure out where that person is in the middle of an incident. Again, helping our first responders so they know exactly where to go. And as they take this a step further with augmented reality, being able to look at a suspect that they're chasing and determine based on facial recognition and pattern recognition whether that person is going to shoot them, whether they're just faking, or whether there's other incidents going on, being able to whisper in the ear of the first responder, no, this guy is just nervous, don't worry about it, or you need to get out of there because he looks like he's about ready to shoot something. So these are things that are really going to be helpful for our first responders as we get more and more into the 5G and have better bandwidth and lower latency. Another area that's really interesting is sort of the manufacturing side of things. And this is where we see a new type of technology such as private LTE, being able to, say, take a oil and gas company and have both a macro LTE environment outside, but as you go into the oil and gas plant or the refinery, have a private LTE, so all communications there are over LTE and secure, but also you don't have to pay for the costs. We're seeing that really big in manufacturing, where wired infrastructure is really inflexible. If we look at what Elon Musk did, so he had his Series 3 cars were being produced in the plant, and they didn't have enough production, so he went to the parking lot, set up a big tent, and put out another factory line. Now, they couldn't do that very easily if they had to wire everything up, so maybe they used Wi-Fi, but I believe they were really trying to do it quickly with a wired infrastructure. Private LTE could really help that, because then when you're dealing with that, you don't have to have as many access points. The congestion of Wi-Fi isn't there because the bandwidth that you need, such as CBRS and the 3.5 megahertz spectrum, isn't overcrowded, and it allows them to actually use a private LTE as something for handling that type of bandwidth, both upload and download, and get you the latency and bandwidth requirements that you might need. Again, 5G for manufacturing is also going to help out when we deal with the latency for other manufacturing plants. So being able to have sort of regional-based manufacturing data centers as opposed to having a data center on every plant is going to save money in that regards as well. But let's look and see where we are today. So as we look forward in the next 3 to 5 years, there will be 5G as part of the roadmap. So anybody working today should consider 5G and how it will impact your technology roadmap. If you want to have something that's low latency and high speed, maybe the traditional way of redesigning our legacy networks are a bit inefficient. Things such as VPN tunnels don't scale very well because they don't have the ability to be very efficient from a latency perspective. Centralizing your data center firewalls made sense in the old school WAN days, but it may not as we go forward, because I've seen security stacks at 100 to 150 milliseconds worth of latency. And if you're doing something with augmented reality or some other type of scenario, you want to keep that latency down to the 10 to 20 millisecond range, and that may not be possible. So we have to figure out how we redesign things. We're at that same turning point, I feel, that we did in the early 2000s when we went from a routed LAN network to a switched LAN network. Now we're seeing it's still a routed WAN network, but the speeds and the latency are decreased to making it appear very much like the WAN will appear very much like the LAN networks that we have today, which means we need to redesign our corporate applications to take advantage of what we call mobile edge compute, deploying a distributed architecture to lower your latency. And then we need to look at the edge devices and see what's going to be the limiting factor there. Interface speeds are a big thing. You can't have a 2.5 gig service or a 2.4 gig service from a 5G perspective when your highest speed from your interface is only a gigabit coming into the enterprise. So we're looking at both 10 gigabits per second as well as the 2.5 and 5 gig standard that's been out there for a few years for APs, because they had the same environment that they had to have faster interfaces. And as we look at the CPU capabilities and other things, that is going to possibly be the limiting factor of what type of speed you can get. You know, a 2 gig or 5 gig router isn't the cheapest thing in the world anymore, and being able to have that and have the license to support that from the CPU is going to be critical. So maybe it's time to rethink about what type of gear is being put in at the edge so that you can take advantage of the increased bandwidth that's available. Now, if we still go with the standard going to the corporate data center or everything going to the core network, as we increase our speeds at the edge, we need to look and see what type of bandwidth increases we also need to have at the core to service those edges much more efficiently. So let's talk about where we're going on the pathway to 5G. You know, the idea from a performance perspective, as you want to get on and understand and build a wireless practice for yourself and your customers, utilize today's speeds to figure out where you are and grow with the 1 gigabit as that comes forward. And then obviously as 5G comes out, leverage what they're going to have, which is up to 10 gig. From an experience center, learn cellular technology. Learn SD-WAN as you go more, and then of course learn what the 5G cellular is, because that has some different physics that go along with it. And having you as a trusted advisor for your customers is really where we want people to play. The solutions that we deal with are really simple. So to get on the bandwagon and on the pathway to 5G, just start with your customers with adding cellular failover, or if they don't want to do that, add what we call parallel networking, which is a sort of an unobtrusive way of adding cellular into the mix so they understand how it works and what the prices are and get some idea of where they want to take the applications in the future. As you get comfortable with that and you start growing, add cellular as an active link. And so as we get the Gigabit LTE, we could have that as an augmentation of existing bandwidth and sell higher packages for data usage and add that in as an active link so that you have the right bandwidth at the right time for the right price. And when we get to 5G, obviously add the applications that make sense from a 5G perspective into the mix. So what's Cradlepoint doing to help this out? So we have a couple of different tiers of consulting workshops that go into a lot more detail. And the first one is what we would call our Tier 1 on the Fortune 1000. It does require a C-level participation. And the reason it requires that is that we're actually doing a high-level overview, but when we talk about the impacts to the business, the idea is that there are things that CIOs need to be aware of and need to be able to affect change within the organization. If we're dealing with the lower-level guys, they can't necessarily gather in all of the IT requirements and say, oh, we're going to do this, because the application programmers need to be involved. The data analysts need to be involved. A lot of things need to be involved. Then as we talk about it, we need to then branch out into other business units outside of IT. You know, the typical question I ask a CIO is, in the past year or two, what applications have you sold your users that you couldn't do because A, you didn't have enough bandwidth, or B, you didn't have the right amount of latency, or it was too high, or C, the cost was too great to put it on cellular. So these are the type of things that we're doing from a Tier 1 workshop. Alternatively, we offer a Tier 2 workshop, which is coming out here this month, which will be a multimedia web session. Not necessarily a webinar like this, but a series of videos that allows you to go over what we cover in the consulting workshop, but in a bit of an abridged content, and then go into a use case overview with individual customers where follow-up by the people on this call would be critical, so that you could actually have that ability to build a bridge between the customer and 5G. Now, at this point, if that person decides they want to bring in the C-level and they want to get down in deep in details, we could then obviously go to a Tier 1 workshop and go into in-depth about the use case opportunities. But this at least gives them, the customers, the ability to start small and understand, and gives you credibility that you're working with somebody who understands what 5G is and where it's going. So the pathway for our customers, in a summary: explore transformative use cases. What is the next Uber that's going to be out there? What's the next Spotify? What's the next whatever application that we haven't even thought of? And how do we take it from there? Because as a CIO, you only have 3 jobs: make money, save money, or gain a competitive advantage for your company. As we talk about use cases, conduct planning meetings with other department heads and get deeper and wider with your customers so that you understand what their business is and how you can actually enable them to be 5G ready. Because as I said, in the next 3 to 5 years, we will have 4G, or we will have 5G as part of a solution. Now, obviously, the second step would be incorporating 4G in their WAN infrastructure, and that's the point where Globalgig can definitely help out, and to incorporate 4G into every WAN solution, either for business continuity, for IoT, or for primary connectivity. And obviously, it's the perfect time to do MPLS to SD-WAN migration, figure out what makes sense there. Of course, engage Globalgig, and they can engage us as necessary. But go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, Roger. So thank you. And on this pathway to 5G, right? Most of the rollouts are 2019 plus and if you think about high, ubiquitous availability of services, they're still out a bit. So the 2 biggest kind of things to do now are one, what you did in this webinar, which is to become more educated, so you can continue to be an expert and a consultant for your customer. Roger spoke of a couple of the programs that Cradlepoint offers that we can assist you with, Globalgig can assist you with in conjunction with Cradlepoint for workshops. But the number one most important thing you can do is sell them 4G now. They are putting it into their network, whether it's an IoT use case, whether it's for business continuity. There is, as we all know, a massive migration in the WAN taking place to virtualizing the WAN from MPLS. It is the perfect moment to incorporate 4G proactively into all customer networks, and there is no more efficient way or effective way for you to prepare your customer and be the consultant that they utilize as 5G really starts to come on board. And with the education you have and continue to build, you'll be in a perfect spot to help them. So, Roger, thank you. Thanks a ton. And I guess I'll open it up to any questions that any attendees would have. I'm going to unmute all mics here. And if anybody has a question, feel free to speak up.
One of the things, I'll just throw a question out there. One of the things that a lot of customers have been asking us is, when is 5G going to be ready? And a lot of that depends on what they mean by ubiquitous 5G. So obviously the first step is Gigabit LTE, But as we see announcements made in October for Verizon, either today or shortly today or tomorrow, they're going to be announcing it with AT&T. Sprint and T-Mobile in the U.S. are announcing they're doing something in 2019. But is that going to be available for the general populace or the enterprise to support? In a lot of cases, the answer is no, because there's limited markets where 5G has been deployed for AT&T and Verizon. But the side note to that is there's also a limited number of devices that are 5G ready. And that comes down to the standards being rapidly ratified and the chip manufacturers trying to catch up as quickly as they can. So as we go forward with devices, it's looking like there will be mobile hotspots or something along those lines that take advantage of the 5G and then take that out as a Wi-Fi environment. Looking back in history, when 4G was first announced with Verizon, the router of choice was the Cradlepoint at that point, but the modem was a USB stick at that time. And so we had a good idea of what was going on, and we took a consumer-grade USB stick, understood what was happening under the covers, had better drivers to be able to handle that, and were able to take a consumer device and make it more enterprise-grade. We're working with the various network operators and their mobile hotspots that are coming out in 2019 or at the end of this year. Things like AT&T announced they have a Netgear Nighthawk is going to be their Wi-Fi hotspot. So working with that type of device and making it more enterprise grade to understand what's happening on the 5G signal and being able to fail over to a different 4G if that device gets frozen or so forth, to be able to make that much more enterprise grade as we go forward. 2019 will be a year of testing, a lot of testing and a lot of trials to figure out what we can actually do. There will be a few instances where people can put it into production, but I'm saying probably 2019 is the pathway to get on the Gigabit LTE and also start using their mobile hotspots and take it from there to figure out where that goes. As we get into 2020, that's when we start seeing routers like stuff provided by Cradlepoint to be able to first in 5G to actually have a 5G type device that either plugs into your existing Cradlepoint session or is an augmentation for something like millimeter wave, which will come out in the 2020 timeframe.
Well, perfect. Well, Roger, it doesn't appear we have any questions, so I want to thank everybody for attending today. And Roger, yep. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to let you know that we did have a question come in. It's what is the anticipated cost for the 5G service?
So that's a good question. So I can tell you what Verizon's offered their service out, and then you can determine whether or not that's going to be something that's something going forward. So Verizon's Gigabit symmetrical service is $50 for the consumer if you have a Verizon account and $70 if you don't. So if you look at that, you see where the line in the sand has been drawn. It puts the cable companies and DSL providers right in the sights of these 5G fixed wireless deployments. Why would I want to spend $150 a month on, let's say, a cable company's gigabit service that gives me maybe 900 down but only 50 up, when I could spend $50 a month or $70 a month for something that's going to be giving me 450 to 500 up and down at the same time? You know, it's pretty much a no-brainer. Now, will that continue on until 2019? Your mileage may vary, but we're seeing people going away from pay per bit to a fixed cost with bandwidth limitations instead. Hopefully that helps. From a device hardware perspective, we're seeing that the operators will more than likely subsidize equipment such as these mobile hotspots to begin with, because the cost of developing something like that is fairly high, but they want to get massive market adoption as they have in the past. So sign a 2-year contract, get a mobile hotspot for X number of dollars, but you're signed up for 2 years and have to deal with that.
And Roger, isn't one of the keys, at least in kind of the early phases, early years of 5G, will be the millimeter wave and its inability to penetrate media? So that's external correct. Antennas will be whether it's consumer or enterprise, right, or business, It will not be like today's, when we put a Cradlepoint in, and that sits in the office, and you can get a great signal on 4G LTE, and excellent 4G LTE performance. With 5G and the millimeter wave, isn't it true that there will be a need for external antennas in order to get the performance you need out of that?
And that's either external antennas, but more than likely it's not even that. It's external units that live outside. So having a modem like we do with our 850 outside the building or close to the window to be able to get that, separating out the wireless interface from the actual physical router. And we've learned how to do that a few years ago with the 850, being able to have a PoE-powered device. And we're investigating that as an option when we talk about the ability to support millimeter wave. Now, if you remember when we talked about the spectrum chart, there are a few customers or a few operators that have sub-6 bandwidth that they'll be turning on first. So I'm not pushing one carrier over the other, but obviously Verizon has said they're starting out with 28 megahertz, which is in the millimeter wave, but at some point they'll also turn on the lower ends. T-Mobile, on the other hand, has said they're turning on 5G at 600 megahertz. So you won't need an outdoor unit. You'll just need to have something that can grab those signals. Not necessarily the highest speeds compared to the millimeter wave, but it goes a long ways. All operators will be slowly migrating their existing spectrum from 4G only to 4G and 5G at the same time, which will allow them to introduce mobility and get away from some of the limitations that millimeter wave will have. But again, it's a journey, and we're just in that first step of that journey, and that was millimeter wave with Verizon on a certain speed. But as we go forward in 2019, we need to take it from there.
Perfect. Chris, did any other questions come in?
Yeah, we do. So with the significant investments that the carriers are making into this new equipment and lower latency and all the things you talked about with 5G, will the carriers actually be able to provide service level agreements to end users?
That's a good question. I can't put words in their mouth, but the idea there is it's still a physics problem, so they can craft some sort of legal statement, but I believe the way we're going is that instead of having a fiber only with an SLA, you might have a fiber as well as a Gigabit LTE or 5G SLA that ties the two together. I had several hospitals come to me and say, I really love having the fiber, but it takes, XYZ provider more than 6 weeks that they told me it would take. It takes, 3 to 5 months to be able to get a fiber in. But if I had 5G, I could turn that up day one and have some ability to run my business still without having to worry about it. And then when the fiber does come in, I can keep that as my backup, but it'll still work just as well as my backup. So I guess that's where we're going. But I haven't heard anybody offer an SLA over wireless because the physics is unique.
Okay, and another follow-up question. You referenced private LTE. Who would actually own the frequency for that? Would it be an individual user, or would it be like a metropolitan area that would actually provide that?
So private LTE is an interesting one. So CBRS, or the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, is a 3.5 gigahertz band that is available and what we call lightly licensed. For the average individual enterprise, they could use it in an unlicensed mode, but they don't have priority access. For a major operator, let's say Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, or whatever, they could actually purchase the license and get priority access over some of that spectrum and handle that way. And so basically when AT&T or Verizon or whomever isn't using that spectrum, you as a business can use it. But if you're using it as a business and you're using it only inside a building, when it doesn't penetrate out, more than likely you're not going to be interfering with anything else because you own that piece of spectrum and you own that sort of area. Now, the other side of the coin is a licensed spectrum play. So a couple of the operators around the globe are actually providing licensed spectrum as private LTE. So might use band 1, let's just say throw a band out there, it's owned by an operator, but the operator is the one managing my network. And so when I'm within my building on band 1, I'm not paying for anything, but when I go outside, I can migrate to the macro network and use that licensed spectrum. We have other opportunities. For instance, we have a large mining concern north of the Arctic Circle in Baffin Bay, Canada, that's actually using band 14 up there. Now, it's the middle of nowhere, and they asked the Canadian government if they could use it because they're not using band 14 for anything, and nobody else is around, and so that's an opportunity that they used licensed spectrum in an unlicensed fashion. They didn't pay much for that because nobody else is using it. So those are options. Now we talk about oil and gas and what happens out in the Gulf. You're in international waters, and at that point, all bets are off, and you can put a private network in on something as long as you negotiate with your neighbors as to what the best thing is for you. Hope that answers the question for private LTE.
And we have no further questions at this time.
Well, perfect. Well, Roger and Chris and Cradlepoint, thank you so much. Just tremendous information. And all of our partners that joined today, I hope you found it valuable. Again, you'll get a recording of this as well as the deck. And know that Globalgig and Cradlepoint are here to help, whether it be 4G, 5G, or even 3G if it's an IoT, or NB-IoT if it's IoT. We are here to help with all wireless use cases. So thank you for your time today, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you all. Have happy holidays.
Bye-bye.